Okay, so picture this for a second. Imagine if countries like India, China, Japan, and Australia all suddenly got together and decided to just completely erase their trade barriers. Imagine if they allowed their citizens to live and work anywhere across each other's borders without a single visa, shared the exact same laws, used the exact same currency, and even coordinated their technology and climate policies. I mean, it sounds literally impossible, right? Human history generally tells us that nations guard their borders and their rulebooks fiercely. And yet, over on the European continent, they've actually spent the last 70 years building something that looks remarkably close to that impossible vision.
Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're unpacking one of humanity's absolute most ambitious political and economic experiments, the European Union. We're going to look at how countries that once fought the most devastating wars in human history completely transformed themselves into partners. They built this massive geopolitical machine that influences literally everything, from the specific charger you use for your smartphone all the way to global climate policy.
Part 1. The Impossible European Experiment. Let's jump right in and define what the EU actually is.
So, the European Union is a completely unique political and economic union currently made up of 27 European countries. It's really important to note that it's not a single country, but it is way, way more deeply integrated than your standard trade alliance. These 27 independent nations cooperate on a massive scale. They align their trade, their economics, their environmental standards, and even their security. Basically, they agree to play by a shared set of rules to boost their mutual prosperity and keep things stable. Now, here's something people get mixed up all the time, so let's clear it up right away. Europe and the EU are not the same thing. Europe is the physical continent. The EU is a very specific political and economic club. So, for example, Norway and Switzerland are physically located in Europe, but they are not in the EU club. And of course, the United Kingdom physically remains in Europe, but as we all know, they officially left the EU recently. Moving on to part 2, from ashes to superpower. To really get why any nation would willingly give up some of its own power to join this club, we have to look back at the original problem the EU was built to solve. Look at Europe in 1945. World War I and World War II had completely devastated the continent. Economies were wiped out, infrastructure was just leveled, and tens of millions of people were dead. Trust between these nations was practically zero. European leaders desperately needed a completely new approach to guarantee this continent never, ever tore itself apart again. And their foundational idea was actually brilliant in its simplicity. Countries that trade together and depend on each other economically are materially much less likely to go to war with one another. Let's track how this snowballed. It started small in 1951 with just 6 countries pooling their coal and steel industries. You know, the very materials you actually need to build weapons and wage war. By 1957, this became the European Economic Community. Fast forward to 1993, and the Maastricht Treaty officially gives birth to the modern European Union. By 1999, they take a massive leap and launch a shared currency, the euro. It's been this long, relentless path of expansion, though obviously it hasn't been without its setbacks, like in 2020 when the UK finalized Brexit and walked away from the Union. Section 3. How the machine works. Okay, so that's the history. But how does a multinational bureaucracy of this size actually function on a daily basis? Let's pop the hood. The best way to wrap your head around this whole national sovereignty versus shared EU power thing is to think of it like a giant housing society. In this analogy, the 27 countries are the residents. Every resident keeps their own home, meaning they keep their own distinct cultures, their own specific national taxes, and their independent governments. But they jointly manage the roads, the neighborhood security, and the community rules. So they stay sovereign, but they share authority over the entire neighborhood. So how do those neighborhood rules actually get made? It's basically a 3-step flow. First, the European Commission, which acts kind of like the executive branch, proposes a new law. Next, the European Parliament, representing the actual citizens, and the Council, representing the national governments, debate and vote on it. Finally, if it passes, all 27 member countries are legally required to go back home and implement it. At the absolute core of all these rules is the single market, and this relies on something called the Rule of Four, or the Four Freedoms: the free movement of goods, services, capital, and people. Practically, this means an engineer from Spain can just pack up and move to Germany for a job with zero hassle. A French bank can seamlessly invest in Italy, and Polish goods can roll right into Belgium without ever stopping for customs checks. It is absolutely the beating heart of the EU economy. Beyond just the single market, the EU runs some seriously massive operational systems. You've got the Eurozone managing the common euro currency, though quick side note, not all 27 members actually use the euro. Then there's the Schengen Area, which is amazing. It allows for completely passport-free travel across much of the continent, basically erasing physical borders for over 400 million people. They also run a common agricultural policy to keep European farming afloat and a super strict competition policy to bust up corporate monopolies.
But how do they actually agree to run all this? Well, they use a highly specific voting structure. For everyday, standard decisions, they use qualified majority voting. That just means a law passes if a certain majority of countries representing a majority of the population say yes. But for the really highly sensitive stuff, like foreign policy or taxation, they require unanimous agreement. Literally, every single one of the 27 countries has to say yes. Now, this is great for protecting the sovereignty of smaller nations, but as you can imagine, it can make building consensus painfully slow.
All right, part 4, a global regulatory superpower. Let's zoom out a bit. We've seen the internal mechanics, but how does this influence the rest of the planet?
Here is where it gets fascinating. The EU doesn't project global power through a massive unified military. Instead, they use their immense market access. Experts call this the Brussels effect. Because the EU is one of the biggest, richest consumer markets on Earth, global companies desperately want to sell their stuff there. But to do that, they have to meet the EU's incredibly strict rules. And rather than spending millions making 2 different versions of a product, multinational companies often just adopt the EU's regulations globally. It's a game changer. That is exactly how the EU dictates worldwide standards on things like digital privacy, AI, and climate policy. And for the ordinary citizen, these high-level regulations translate into real, everyday protections. Think about the GDPR. It totally transformed how companies handle your personal data all over the world. Their strict product standards guarantee that the food you eat and the electronics you buy are actually safe. And, of course, their core economic policies make sure that cross-border work and travel remain highly accessible.
Part 5, the India connection. So how does this massive regulatory superpower interact with major global partners? Let's use their strategic relationship with India as a prime example.
The crucial takeaway here is that this relationship is a really delicate balancing act of massive opportunity and incredibly strict regulation. The EU is one of India's top trading partners, and there is a huge horizon of opportunity with ongoing free trade agreement talks. In the tech sector, they are partnering up closely on AI and semiconductor infrastructure. But the real challenge for Indian exporters is dealing with the EU's strict environmental standards. Things like their new carbon border regulations bring very high compliance costs if you want to do business there. Which brings us to Section 6, Challenges and the Future. Look, the EU is undeniably powerful, but it is far from perfect. Let's talk about the stress tests currently shaking the foundations of the whole project. Critics are quick to point out the heavy bureaucracy and that agonizingly slow decision-making process we talked about earlier. There's also a very real issue of unequal economic performance between the wealthier northern nations and the southern or eastern members. Plus, you have deep, ongoing internal debates over migration policies. And perhaps the biggest friction point of all, national sovereignty. A lot of citizens feel that way too much power has been handed over to bureaucrats in Brussels. That, of course, was the core argument that ultimately drove the UK to push for Brexit.
But despite those internal divisions, the EU has an incredibly ambitious roadmap for the next 5 to 10 years. They are heavily focused on securing their digital and energy sovereignty. They are currently pioneering the world's first major AI act. They're pushing a massive Green Deal to transition their climate policy, pouring billions into domestic semiconductor manufacturing so they don't have to rely on foreign chips, and aggressively pursuing total energy independence. When you really step back and look at the big picture, though, the historical achievement here is pretty undeniable. United in diversity is the official motto of the EU, and it perfectly captures the essence of this whole project. Despite all the flaws, the heavy bureaucracy, and the slow voting, a continent of former mortal enemies has somehow managed to maintain decades of peace, cooperation, and shared prosperity. Which leaves us looking toward the horizon. The European Union is without a doubt one of humanity's most fascinating experiments. But as it faces the next decade, a massive question remains. Is this ongoing push for deeper technological and economic integration going to solidify the EU as an unquestionable, unstoppable global superpower? Or will the internal divisions, the uneven economics, and the fierce desire to protect national sovereignty eventually bring the whole housing society down? Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer.
Until next time, keep learning, keep thinking, and keep growing.